There are few places in Britain that can say they put words into the English dictionary, and fewer still that can say they put two words into the English dictionary. Carron is one of those later ones, and it's not associated with food, which is very unusual. The first word or words was the Carron oil, which was used for treating skulls. And in fact, the very first person to be treated at Falkirk Cottage Hospital was a moulder who'd been scalded at work and was treated with Carron oil. The second word, of course, is carronade, which is a wonderful play on the word carronade, and of course it refers to a type of weapon invented and manufactured at the Carron works. Originally, the carronade was called the Gascoignade, after the manager of the works. And because Gascoignade was already a word in the English language, and it meant to bluster, to show off, so very, very appropriate for a cannon of the nature of a carronade. And just as with China, when you're referring to pottery, it has a small C at the beginning of it, so the place name has a capital, carronade doesn't. The carronade was a short-range weapon with a large bore and a high muzzle velocity. It was essentially a cross between a howitzer and a long cannon, and it was a weapon conceived by General Robert Melville from his experiences of warfare. And although he came up with the concept in the 1770s, it was the Carron Company who did the practical development of the weapon itself. One of the first things they realised, of course, was that they needed a very high-grade iron in its manufacture. And they started blending the different iron ores from the different locations to produce what they called grey iron. And then they tested the iron to make sure it was appropriate. So it's the beginning of a semi-scientific approach to the production of materials. And then they cast the cannon solid, which meant they didn't have the bore in the centre. They hired John Smeaton, who was one of the leading engineers in the world at the time, to design a drilling method to take out the bore through the centre. And what this meant was that the sides of the bore of the cannon were not full of gas pockets and holes, and therefore there weren't points of weakness which might cause the carronade to explode during use, which was quite useful. The second thing that the Carron Company did was to reduce what's known as the windage, which is the gap between the cannonball and the bore of the gun. And that meant that when the gunpowder, which was behind the cannonball, was ignited and it expanded at a very, very rapid rate, and therefore projected the ball forwards, there was less of that expanding gas around the gap around the cannonball, and most of it was used to push the cannonball out of the carronade, which is why they were able to achieve a high muzzle velocity. It also meant that the gun was far more accurate because with a cannon with a large windage, it meant that the ball rattled around as it left the cannon, and depending on where it ricocheted on the last occasion depended on the way it came out of the gun. With a narrow windage, that didn't occur, so it was a more accurate weapon. And for the first time, cannons or carronades actually had to have sight lines in order to point them towards the enemy ships. But the main advantage of the carronade was that it weighed a third that of a conventional long gun. That was great for the merchant navy because it meant they could carry the weapon and more cargo. Or, of course, with a naval ship, it meant they could carry 3 weapons instead of 1. So, wonderful achievement. But because it was shorter and because all cannons at this time were breech-loaded, it meant that it could be fired more rapidly as well. It took less time to reload, and it also took fewer men to do that. So there's savings all the way around. It was known in the Navy as a smasher because it was used at relatively close quarters. In the Napoleonic period, most of the ships, a lot of which were privateers, were trying to capture the enemy boat in order to get the prize money. They weren't trying to sink it. So they had to come into very, very close quarters to do that. And at a medium range, the cannon projected from a carronade loses its velocity and it punches a very jagged hole in the hulk of the enemy ship, and that sends splinters flying all over the place, and it's the splinters which kill the personnel in those lower decks of the ships, so quite important. At the Battle of Trafalgar, the first gun to be fired on HMS Victory was a 68-pounder carronade loaded with a keg of shot. And they fired it into the stern of the Beau Centaur and basically sprayed shot through the lower two decks, killing most of the personnel on those decks. So a wonderful weapon at close range. However, it had its flaws. It was useless at long distances. And so when we came to fight in the American Wars of Independence, we were using carronades, and the Americans stuck to their conventional long guns, and they were able to take pot shots at the Royal Navy from long distances. And partly as a consequence of that, we lost the Wars of Independence, which may be a good or a bad thing depending on the way you look at it. But the Carron Company didn't stop there with their innovative technology for the carronade. They started using a suspension loop on the underside of the barrel instead of the usual trunnions on either side, which again was a great saving in metal and more reinforced as well. They used an elevation screw in order to tilt the cannon forwards and downwards, rather than the wedge that had been used previously, and of course the screw was then adopted for every future weapon from then on. They also redesigned the truck on which the cannon sat. So they had a slightly inclined lower truck and a sledge on the top, so that as the gun recoiled, the sledge on the top had to go up a slight incline, and that is the beginning of the recoilless gun. So most weapons after this were based on the carronade. So the reason why this is the night of 10.5 objects is because it indicates the technical proficiency of British industry at a time we were building a massive new empire. It demonstrates innovation and the new semi-scientific approach to production. And also it augurs in the beginnings of 2 centuries of iron founding in the Falkirk district.